Wild Fish Conservancy came to Clayoquot Sound to try to understand why salmon populations here are in collapse.
Clayoquot Sound, on the west coast of British Columbia's Vancouver Island, is a world-famous ecological treasure. Following the biggest environmental protest in Canadian history, which saw tens of thousands flock here in the early 1990s to protect it from logging, the region was named a UNESCO Biosphere Reserve and is now home to a thriving ecotourism industry. But years after the war in the woods, Clayoquot is far from protected. At the core of its environmental troubles lies the staggering collapse of once plentiful wild salmon runs, upon which the whole ecosystem depends.
The bears and other predators of salmon will absolutely be impacted as the numbers of wild fish continue to decline.
These communities have been built around the wilderness and these pristine areas and the services they provide. Ecotourism is an enormous industry for the BC coast.
Much of Clayoquot's river habitat for fish is still in relatively good shape, thanks in part to the work of conservationists to limit logging, which makes the disappearing salmon puzzling to researchers like those at the Washington state-based Wild Fish Conservancy. The organization has been running a research project here for the past 2 years, looking into one of the potential causes for this situation: salmon farms.
Some of the potential culprits include Atlantic salmon net pens like the one behind me, as well as harvest and ocean conditions. Interestingly, here in Clayoquot Sound, the watersheds, for the most part, are relatively intact. And so it's an unusual opportunity for us to be able to rule out the freshwater ecosystem.
I caught up with the research team in Clayoquot last year and recently returned at the end of this year's program.
Cal A.
We saw a magnificent place in the middle of a major biosphere that has salmon that are collapsing. It has some of its rivers are totally old growth, pristine habitats. The prevailing opinion is if you have healthy habitats, you'll have healthy salmon. We came here because this broke that mold.
Some of the systems we've been looking at would be Herbert Inlet, where you have the Moyaha River, which is a pristine river. It's running out of Strathcona Provincial Park. The Meegan, it's a similar situation, old growth forest, no logging camps, no roads, no mining, very little damage to the freshwater habitats there. And yet there's a number of salmon farms on the outmigration pathway between those rivers and the open Pacific. And we are seeing significant lice loading on juvenile chum salmon.
The impacts of open net salmon farms on wild salmon and sea trout populations have been well documented in the world's top scientific journals. These enormous open feedlots, which in BC can contain up to 1 million fish at a time, are breeding grounds for naturally occurring parasites and pathogens. Located in the migratory routes of juvenile wild salmon, the farms incubate sea lice, bacteria, and viruses, which then attack the vulnerable smolts on their way out to sea. They also dump their waste, chemicals, and toxins into the marine environment. Little has been reported on the dire situation for salmon in Clayoquot Sound, compared with the much publicized problems from salmon farms in the Broughton Archipelago and Discovery Islands regions, on the opposite side of Vancouver Island. But the situation here is no less severe, and the evidence pointing to salmon farms is beginning to pile up.
There have been problems around the world with Atlantic salmon net pens, and we're trying to parse out if it's a problem, how much of a problem is it?
Some of the highest densities anywhere on the coast are here in Clayoquot Sound. You have inlets such as Bedwell Sound that have 7 farms in them. And that's a lot of salmon farms and not necessarily a very large area.
We started sampling last year, and we're continuing to sample now, and some of the preliminary data are showing a higher abundance of sea lice on juvenile Pacific salmon that migrate past Atlantic salmon net pens.
We've been sampling the chum salmon out here on Vargas Island in Clayoquot Sound today, and we caught about 20 chum, and only 6 of them had no lice.
This is a coho smolt with an adult female caligus louse on it. You can see its egg strings trailing behind it. There are also immature lice on its dorsal fin and on its pelvic fin.
So this is a Chinook smolt we caught in Cypress Bay on Clayoquot Sound, and you can see it has a male salmon louse near its head there.
The first thing that really jumps out at you from the data that our researchers have been collecting is a very strong correlation between the amount of Atlantic salmon net pens that we see in each fjord and the amount of sea lice that we're finding on individual juveniles as they outmigrate. It has a very negative effect to their long-term survival.
As these graphs clearly show, the more farms per fjord, the more sea lice outmigrating chum and Chinook smolts pick up along the way. In some cases, what are acknowledged to be lethal levels. Lice numbers rise with each farm the juvenile salmon pass. By stark contrast, the smolts that migrate through fjords with few or no farms pick up virtually no lice.
The first place we're going to go is finish analyzing our data, and then we're going to be publishing in a major technical journal so that we give good information to good people and hopefully they'll make some good choices.
Clearly, there's work yet to be done with this research, but it's hard not to find this preliminary data deeply troubling, especially in light of the dire state of Clayoquot's wild salmon. Some of these runs are in free fall, which prompted the Canadian Department of Fisheries and Oceans to sound alarm bells in 2009 over the rapidly declining health of Chinook stocks here.
It's probably, in terms of applying the precautionary principle, we need to think about moving these net pens out of these type of systems. Closed containment is certainly one option. Potentially interim steps could be taken, such as fallowing the farms during the outmigration season, not necessarily having such dense loadings of fish in the farms. But I certainly think that if we continue on the path that we're on, we're likely to see some severe impacts or continued depression of the populations in the rivers here in Clayoquot Sound.
The Wild Fish Conservancy's work in Clayoquot Sound reminds us of the fragile state of this world-class ecotourism destination, whose spectacular wilderness depends on, above all, wild salmon. Now it remains to be seen what Canadians and the world's conservation community will do about this latest threat to the place they fought so hard to protect in the past, a place that needs their help now more than ever.